Fritz. Today I'm taking a walk on these train tracks which lead to a nuclear power station that's behind me, but that's not really the point. The point is, tonight's video is gonna be very special because I think we can say I've been training for it my whole life. Basically, tonight we're building a train. Here's how we're gonna do it tonight. The kit is nice, and if you build it the standard way, there should be no problems. However, because I'm building a rusty Hulk, I have to chop and modify it a little, so let's focus on those parts and skip the obligatory gluing of kit parts together, okay? The undercarriage has these service doors of some kind, but they're missing in my reference image. But because there are no openings for them, I have to make them myself. I used them as a template to drill out each corner and then flip the part around so I could remove the plastic from the inner side. Placing a light source underneath will tell us how much material we've removed. Then I flipped it around again and used a Tamiya scriber to connect those 4 holes. After that, it's pretty easy to remove the panel with a hobby blade and then do some additional chiseling and scribing to make the plastic evenly thin and the opening nice and tidy. This part will be completely rusted out, so I added a bit of texture using diluted Tamiya putty, and once the entire undercarriage was stippled, I gently polished the surface with a sanding sponge. The inside of the cabin is full of ejector pin marks. After all, they have to be placed somewhere, and it's always better to put them out of sight, but because the inside of my model will be quite visible, I spent some extra time removing them. Most of them can be eliminated by scraping and sanding, and it's a pretty satisfying job. I also printed a random diesel engine which I found on Colts 3D. I just had to squeeze and stretch it so it would fit nicely. I'll leave you a link in the description. I just added a few parts that were too squashed, and the whole point of this detail is to have at least something in the engine compartment so it wouldn't look like an empty void. The kit comes with plastic screens for the engine, and while you can drill them out, most of them were missing in my reference. It also seems that these locomotives were modified and fixed multiple times, so it's not uncommon to see something like chicken wire acting as a screen. The control sticks are overly thick, so I made new ones from evergreen profiles. Here's a cool trick I learned as a kid. To make the balls at the end, you just have to dip them multiple times in superglue until you get a satisfying result. A simple upgrade, but one that makes a big difference in the end. Also, I considered replacing all the steps with metal so I could add realistic dents, but that would mean reworking every anti-slip surface with a photo-etched replacement, and that would be just too much hacking. So instead I thinned them down, added some dents, glued them in place, and made new support from evergreen strips, which I bolted to the hull with small bolts punched from tinfoil. The roof is much easier to replace, and it'll make a huge difference. After taking the dimensions from the original part, I cut a new one from copper foil. I like to polish these parts because it eliminates the ugly sharp edges and gives the metal a nice, clean look. After bending the ends using the original part as a jig, I simply superglued it in place, but just on this side because I'm keeping the second wall removable for easy access to the interior. The inner braces probably weren't necessary because they're gonna be barely visible, but it was good fun. While the glue was drying, I could add those realistic dents visible in my reference image. And once it was dry, I removed the excess superglue with a VMS debonder. All of a sudden, even a messy job can be turned into a perfectly clean finish. I used the same method on these rain covers, although here I had to employ a bit more effort and dry fitting. They seem to have been fabricated additionally as a sort of improvised modification, and their complex shape lends itself to soldering, but with a careful approach, superglue and debonder will do the job just fine. And lastly, I made some rain gutters as well. These actually come in the kit, but the ones in my reference are much simpler in design. No openings for downspouts, just a simple half pipe so the water can stream down the sides of the cabin. Alright, that's the pancake train finished. It has such a weird shape and overall it's a weird subject, but I'm glad we have it as a kit in 1/35 scale because it's such a weathering playground. But first, let's make a diorama for it. The choice was simple in this case. A compact-sized circular base will allow us to observe the model from all angles. A circle has no front, back or sides, so it makes the composition much easier. And when there are no sides, every viewing angle is the perfect angle. But the pancake train will be placed slightly off-center for a more natural composition. Luckily, the kit comes with railroad tracks. I just had to separate them for easier assembly and especially texturing. A brass wire brush is perfect for adding realistic wood grain texture, and I'm actually glad that they're made from plastic because it's much easier to paint them than actual wood. The result is gonna be quite fuzzy though, but that's easy to rectify with Mr. Cement S. Now I can add all those important elements in place and finish the initial composition. A large concrete bumper behind the train, a dumpster with a stray cat, and a wooden lamppost for extra elevation and visual framing. Very simplistic, but full of potential. So let's start working on these individual structures. The tracks were fixed in place with PVA glue, and while they were drying, I textured the concrete bumper. This green insulation foam turned out to be resistant against Mr. Leveling Thinner, so I used that to dilute the Tamiya putty. And I also mixed a little bit of fine VMS sand into the concoction for good measure. The foam is very porous, so it's not ideal for delicate work, but it works fine for concrete. I just had to cover it in multiple thick layers, and while these were soft, I sprinkled the surface with VMS earth, which contains a few small stones. While everything was still soft but not sticky anymore, I used one of the leftover ties to add the board-formed texture. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but I feel like plastic is much better than balsa wood because it creates a much tighter and cleaner finish. Anyway, once the glue was dry, I used a rotary tool and a straight edge to roughly cut the tracks to the desired shape. It's better to let them protrude a little and do the rest with a sanding sponge. I also added a few simple terrain features with the hobby blade just to make the ground look more dynamic. Now it was time to add the veneer. It's ideal to do it all with a single length of wood because the outward tension and ugly gaps are against us in this game. Once again, I used a hot glue gun because it creates an indestructible bond. However, if the glue starts solidifying before you attach the veneer, it can lead to some serious problems. I measured the veneer precisely, but the added volume of the glue meant that I was left with a gap. Luckily, I was able to close it with a thin strip and cover it all with a generous layer of oak-colored wood putty. This leads to a pretty smooth, almost seamless finish, and once the wood is stained, it's gonna be hardly noticeable. Now I could finally cover the surface with Smart Mud from VMS, which is probably my favorite modeling product of all time. It's super easy to work with, it's lightweight, soft, and it's easy to imprint your models into it, and as a bonus, it dries rock hard. This or any other VMS product is available on their official store, or if you're based in the US, check out Michigan Toy Soldier Company, and if you use the sales codes in the video description, you'll get a small discount, so go check them out. There's also something very satisfying about the look of it. It's like a chocolate diorama cake and everything is nice and tidy. But it's not gonna be like that for long, because now we're gonna add some realistic ground textures. For that basic dirt surface, I used real earth from my garden, trademark, mixed with a few small stones. I also added a good amount of sea balls from AK Interactive, which will serve as that bottom layer of dead grass, and finished it off with natural leaf scatter, which I've made from dry leaves chopped in a food processor. Everything was glued with VMS ballast freeze, which flows very nicely due to its low surface tension and dries super fast. This allowed me to almost immediately proceed with the rock ballast around the track, and here I used gravel from VMS, which has the perfect size for this texture. Once again, it was glued with ballast freeze, no pun intended. Let's not put those sea balls away too quickly, but let's instead try to simulate some grass and tall weeds with it. It's actually very easy to grab small tufts from the ball, dip them in PVA glue, and plant them one by one. It might seem tedious, but actually it doesn't take that much time, and quite frankly it looks more convincing than static grass, at least in some situations. The reference image shows the top of the concrete bumper covered in tall weeds, so I tried brushing some diluted PVA on top of the stalks and sprinkled them with micro leaves from Green Stuff World. It's not totally realistic, but it looks random and natural enough. With that being said, I also employed a bit of static grass, which simply gives you more control as you can fine-tune the length with different packages and also create nicer, less chaotic tufts. It's a nice transition between the wild grass at the back and smaller growth in the front. And once again, most of it was sprinkled with micro leaves because this abandoned train yard seems really neglected. Finally, I just had to assemble the lamp post. It comes from RT Diorama, and although I love scratch building, I can also appreciate the convenience of a pre-made kit. I would replace the wooden dowel with plastic because, as I said, I find it easier to paint, but I didn't have the correct diameter, so the supplied part will have to do. So that's the finished diorama ready for painting, and no, don't check the play bar, this is not the end of the video. We're just getting to the fun part. I just thought that it would be nice to showcase the diorama in its raw state with all the different materials. Also, displaying the electric wires in this way was the most logical solution from the composition standpoint, because having levitating power lines suddenly cut off at each edge of the diorama and just having them going from nowhere to nowhere looks really awkward. So I think sometimes we have to make compromises in favor of the overall presentation of the scene. But anyway, let's start painting. While I'm disassembling everything, let me also mention that the dumpster with the cat, the rat, and the pigeons come from Mantis Miniatures. And I also 3D printed some plastic crates which I found for free on Thingiverse. And I think we'll start by painting the pancake train, okay? Let me do a little magic trick here. Voila! I know, but I wanted to paint the interior first, and because the same techniques are gonna be used outside, I wanted to get it done off camera. Let's consider it a small teaser and quickly close everything off and mask the windows and the air intakes. Priming is usually a two-stage process for me because metal parts receive their dedicated primer for metal, and then I cover the entire thing with Mr. Surfacer. Mahogany is a great primer for rusty surfaces because it's already very similar to the finish we're aiming for. But it dries to a satin finish, so I gave it a light overspray with a rusty color mixed from those two paints in the corner. While I had the mixture in the airbrush, I added a few drops of yellow and painted a few highlights here and there to distinguish some details and add more variety. Then I grabbed my favorite acrylic rust paints from Life Color and speckled them all over the model with this crazy toothbrush gizmo from AK. This step can get a bit messy, but it's a pretty quick job and can greatly enhance the rusty look, especially in areas with lots of exposed metal. I also painted some of the small fixtures in different rust tones and quickly blended these colors in some of the larger areas. Once again, there's no need to create a smooth finish, it's the gritty texture we're aiming for here. Now I could give it a generous coat of chipping fluid and immediately after a very light bluish gray coat applied in uneven, semi-translucent layers. The undercarriage in the reference image is completely rusted out, showing just a few patches of gray, which I assume might be primer. When we have thin layers of paint such as here, It's extremely easy to remove them. The chipping fluid gets activated with tap water and the paint often goes down in large sheets. But that's exactly the effect we're aiming for here. Large patches of gray combined with random spots of texture on all those surfaces. It's also gonna lead to some exciting results once the remaining effects are applied. But all of this is just a warm-up exercise for the main event. For the main body, I started with an overall overspray with pure white. Then I covered it with a faded light green mixture. The white undercoat means we don't have to apply too many layers of the actual paint, so we can achieve full opacity more easily, and because the layer isn't gonna be overly thick, it's gonna be easier to chip it down. Here it's all about control and fineness of the effect, so I'm using an old airbrush needle to disrupt the paint around the edges and a small stiff brush to carefully rub the paint down. The amount depends on the effect we're aiming for, and this subject allowed me to go all out. I also tried to combine large patches of rust with subtle chipping and scratches, and I'll say that creating these large areas often felt really wrong, as if I was losing control or something. But it's in the reference image, and especially the effect is gonna transform drastically once the remaining techniques are in place. Also, it can take up to 6 hours to fully chip a model of this size, so it's definitely not a quick process. Right after that, without any protective varnishing, I gave it another layer of chipping fluid in selected areas. These were sprayed with very thin layers of white, and thin layers mean easy chipping. So without worrying about the previous effect, I could effectively add chipping to those areas as well, adding more texture to the sun-bleached paint. Again, without any varnishing, it was time to remove the masks, because everything after this point will be applied with lots of precision. Most of the rust effects are gonna be applied with an airbrush. I mixed hollow red and flat yellow, diluted them a lot with Mr. Leveling Thinner, and loaded them into my .15 nozzle Fengda airbrush. Some of it will act as post-shading, but in most cases, I'm adding subtle layers of rust, further refining and enhancing the effect on the lower parts. Because the paint is totally flat, it also covers up that slight satin sheen left over by the chipping fluid. On the upper surfaces, I focused it on the large chips and also in the corners. It takes a little bit of practice, but generally, it's a great airbrushing exercise. I love how easy it is to build up the effect in multiple layers and how efficient the method is, because once the paint is on the model, it stays there for good. No waiting for it to dry, no blending or any other thing that's common with oils or enamels. Everything after this point can be considered weathering and aging, and I'll show you how it can be summed up in just a few simple steps. The first one is a pin wash. This is an absolute must for me, total no-brainer, and it's one of the most powerful techniques out there. Besides outlining every small detail and giving them definition, it also enhances the overall aged look of the model. In some areas, I could easily blend the wash away from the detail and create subtle hints of dirt and grime that might have accumulated on the surface over the years. It also makes the model look much sharper, and that's always nice. Now, this next step makes me always feel kinda queasy because I like to keep things clean during the painting process, but sometimes it's the only way. Basically, I'm adding the same mixture of earth, sea balls and leaf scatter in the corners and tight spaces. All of this adds a more natural touch to the model and integrates it into the scenery, even if the model is technically floating on a pair of railroad tracks. This was then blended in with some subtle pre-dusting. I sprayed this earth color all around the natural scatter, but also in some other tight spaces because rust naturally attracts a lot of dust and other nasty things. Now I could use the same enamel wash again to add some stains of moisture and to just generally add more visual interest to these areas. I find it very important to add contrast even in places that would otherwise be rather monotonous in real life. Once that was out of the way, I switched to acrylics from Life Color and dry brushed pretty much every edge on the model to give it more depth. It's one of the old school techniques, but it greatly enhances the worn look, be it on the completely rusted out parts or on the cabin where you have tons of chipping and the dark rust color adds more richness to these areas. It's also useful on the mesh screens, which were quite difficult to chip using the hairspray method. My reference image also showed some mossy stains, and these are a great effect because it's a completely different color than the overall rusty and grimy palette of the model. Yet it's a natural effect that gives a touch of nature, so to say. Just like the natural scatter, it also ties the model with the scenery. And now it's time to finish things off with oil paints. These can be applied as rust washes, such as here on those driver screens, but more importantly, in the form of countless delicate rust streaks coming down from those chipped areas. There are two ways to blend them. One involves a large flat paintbrush, but it leads to a very diffuse, subtle look. And then there's this method, where you blend each dot from both sides. This ends with a very sharp, clearly defined effect, and because we're blending from both sides, we can easily adjust the direction of the streaks. That's very important because they should always follow the direction of gravity. So there we have it, the pancake train is finished and ready to be placed in the diorama. It was so much fun to paint, and the thing I enjoyed the most was the simplicity of the workflow. Sometimes you just don't have to use countless elaborate painting techniques to achieve an interesting finish. So anyway, let's move on to the base. Here I started with the concrete wall because it would be easier to mask once it was finished. I used the same painting techniques I learned on my two building facades, and they all revolve around the use of an ancient black ink trademark. The combination of an airbrushed base coat and a heavy ink wash creates a solid foundation for some additional work with diluted acrylics. I would rather apply them with a sponge for a more textured look, but the tight working conditions thought otherwise. Then I switched to ink again, but this time I outlined the board-formed texture. This way we can make even the faintest details clearly visible. I also applied it as a selective wash in a few places with visible wood grain texture. Finally, I used a light color to pick out all those small surface features for a strong, three-dimensional look. I'll admit that the result isn't the best this time, but luckily it only acts as a backdrop, and most of it is obscured by the model. In my haste and rage of enthusiasm, I completely forgot to stain the veneer. This should be done as the first thing because it can seep into the diorama, messing up things that are already painted. Once again, I used a sponge instead of a paintbrush because the application is way smoother this way. I ended up applying 2 layers for a rich, dark wooden finish. After letting it dry for a while, I covered the sides with masking tape. It's easy to cut it precisely against the veneer with a sharp hobby blade. Now it's all about good times ahead. I decided to completely skip my usual dark priming stage and started painting the base in its raw colors and textures. The fake shadows created by the dark primer have become quite overwhelming in some of my previous works, and I found it hard to add enough lightness to the vegetation. So I wanted to try and see how it would look without the dark undercoat. Turns out you can modify the tones of the grass just as well, and because I used a dusty color as a base coat, it led to some pretty different results. I'm not saying it's ultra realistic, but definitely looks the part. I used buff to fix all of the green overspray on the ground, and deck tan as a base color for the ballast. We'll put more effort here in a moment. Right now, we're just applying the base colors. Painting the old wood in pure white might seem like an odd choice, but you'll see how it all works together. With most of the airbrushing out of the way, I can now remove the tape. Continuing in the same spot, I gave each tie a heavy wash with different sand-colored acrylics. Combined with the white base coat, it leads to a pale, desaturated finish. Then I gave it another wash with black ink, and this is all you need to do to achieve a realistic, worn wooden finish. Rail ties are often very dark because they're impregnated with tar, so I didn't even have to employ any dry brushing or any other techniques. I also flooded the ballast with this ink wash because I noticed it was creating a very nice effect around the ties. The groundwork was very quickly treated with a couple of enamel paints from AK, and I gotta say that AK products combined with VMS and Tamiya acrylics are my favorite combination. So if you're interested in something from AK, follow the affiliate link in the video description and use a sales coupon if you want to get a nice discount. It'll help me out. Case in point, the tracks were now airbrushed with the same rusty mixture made from Tamiya acrylics which I've used on the pancake train, and they also received some subtle pre-dusting with buff. Then I treated them with an enamel wash and some mossy residue as well, just like on the train. The final touch was picking out some of the stones in different tones of AK 3rd generation acrylics. I like to use sandy and brown colors because they give the gravel a warmer, much more natural tone. Okay, with the groundwork finished, I can superglue the train in place. Now we just need to finish the remaining details, animals, and the lamppost. The plastic crates were totally simple. I airbrushed them with different desaturated Tamiya paints, gave them a dark enamel wash from AK, added some moss deposits to integrate them with the overgrown vegetation, and superglued them in place. The animals from Mantis Miniatures weren't the easiest to paint. They might give the scene a cheesy vibe, but I'm actually happy about that. The pigeons on the roof would probably bring some bird droppings, but I was hesitant to cover up too much of the rusty finish, and besides, birds usually poop from somewhere high above, and there are no trees, power lines, or tall buildings above the train, so I kept the pollution at bay. The finish on the lamppost is a combination of many techniques we already used in this video, and we can see here that natural wood can be painted using the same techniques as plastic. It's also funny how old, rusty parts are usually quite boring, so all I need to do for a nice effect is to base coat them in a dark rusty tone, add a very subtle wash with a lighter rusty color, and then finish them off with an enamel pin wash around small details. I also added that trademark touch of moss deposits towards the bottom, which works especially well on wooden surfaces. This might be another good example of simple, relaxing techniques leading to a pretty convincing result. But let's not forget those rope tighteners I made previously. One of my reference images had a steel rope holding the pole in an upright position, and it was such a cool yet subtle detail. So I twisted some 0.2mm copper wire in an AC drill and made a simple steel rope out of it. No priming, no nothing, just attaching it to the base and quickly treating it with those two rusty acrylic paints. And with that, my mission was finished. Well, my friends, this project started a few months ago when AK sent me an email asking if I'd be interested in their new kit. I didn't even know what it was, so I had to Google it, and one of the first search results was the reference image I used for the whole diorama. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be interested, but having an opportunity to build a civilian subject and a highly unusual one in a setting like this was right up my alley. It felt like that rusty Volkswagen Beetle I did 2 summers ago, but bigger and more involved. I couldn't ask for a more refreshing change from my same old, well-used tanks with a bunch of crew members and stowage on top of them. I also feel like the circular base elevates this diorama to a higher level because it nicely surrounds the main subject, but there are no empty corners. The only thing that really gave me trouble was those animals, because when it comes to weathering, I can pretty much switch between stylistic and more realistic approaches, but with figures, so far I only know one painting style. But apart from that, I didn't have this much fun with the entire project in quite a while. And the next one is also gonna be something completely different, something we haven't ever done on the channel. But until then, I want to sincerely thank every single one of you for watching these videos, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be sitting here building models for a living. And I can't thank you enough for this amazing opportunity. All of this is also possible thanks to my incredible patrons. My whole Patreon page is like a Night Shift magazine subscription, as I post there pretty often. And you'll get updates from my workbench, where I share my thoughts and insights. We can get in touch through DMs, comments, and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos, and those stay there forever, so you can always get back to them. I also have some extra goodies such as 3D models which you can use for detailing your projects, a bunch of real-life references for nature, old buildings and so on, and last but not least these high-resolution studio photos which show the model in more detail than video ever could. It would help me a lot, but no pressure. Anyway, if you managed to get all the way to the end of the video, let me know your guesses about the next model. Until then, stay safe, be nice to one another, take care of each other, build your models, don't just collect them, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers! Friends, today I'm taking... Friends, today I'm taking a walk... Shakbolo! Friends. Today I'm taking a walk on these train tracks which lead to a nuclear power station that's behind me, but that's not really the point. This video is gonna be